Governor, thank you for joining us. Well, thank you for that welcome very much, Diane, and I just need a slightly lower microphone than her. Thank you all for coming this evening. It's great to see a great crowd and actually many familiar faces, so I'm very happy to see you all. I too would like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of the land in which we're meeting this evening, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any First Nations people that are joining us today in the audience and online, so thank you. So thank you to CEDA for the opportunity to be here tonight. I think we, the bank and CEDA, we share an important mission together really. We're both interested in promoting stability and prosperity in Australia. We share objectives around economic research and analysis, as Diane set out. Groups like CEDA play a crucial role in uniting various sectors of the economy and the community to engage in discussions and debates about economic challenges facing Australian households and businesses. And that's what we need. We need more of discussion and challenge and debate. We live in an increasingly complex world. We've got cost of living pressures persisting, technological change accelerating, ongoing conflicts in several zones around the world, and an ever-changing geopolitical landscape. In the face of these numerous global and domestic uncertainties, both our organisations are confronted with significant challenges. Fundamentally, though, speaking for the RBA, our role and focus has not changed, and we're ready to meet the challenges head-on. They're going to be tough. So tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to present the RBA's analysis of economic conditions domestically and internationally. I'm actually often asked, why aren't we cutting rates in Australia yet? And so I'm going to reflect on our monetary policy strategy and how it compares with some of our global peers. I'm also going to provide a bit of an update on changes to our monetary policy processes, some of which you will have seen and some of which you won't. While monetary policy is central to the RBA's mandate, our responsibilities encompass a much broader range of activities that support the overall functioning of the Australian economy. So I'm going to conclude by highlighting some of the initiatives we're undertaking and the transformation underway at the RBA that will ensure the RBA is well placed to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow. But first, to economic conditions here in Australia. So this may be a familiar graph to all of you. Inflation. So headline inflation eased to 2.8% over the year to the September quarter of 2024, and that's down from 5.4% over the year to September quarter of 2023. So this is really, I'd have to say, really welcome relief for people feeling the pinch from the rise in the cost of living over the past 2 years. And that's everyone, but it's particularly the more vulnerable in our community. But despite the decline, there is still some way to go before we return inflation sustainably to within our 2 to 3% target range. Now, I use the word sustainably deliberately. It's important, because it recognises that we need to look through temporary factors that influence the headline inflation rate from time to time. And so over the past year, part of the decline in headline inflation has been due to temporary factors such as electricity rebates and declining fuel prices. These temporary factors have undoubtedly helped many Australians, but our approach is to look through them to some extent to better understand where inflation will settle in the medium term. And the best way to do this is to look at underlying inflation. Now, the measure we typically look at, and it's on this chart, is trimmed mean inflation. And by this measure, inflation was still too high in the September quarter at 3.5%. So while this is a welcome decline from 5.1% a year earlier, it is consistent with a situation in which the overall demand for goods and services in the Australian economy has been outstripping its supply capacity for some time. We have maintained the cash rate at its current level of 4.35% for a little over a year now. This is 4.25 percentage points above its emergency low level of 0.1% at the height of the pandemic, and I highlight emergency low level. At this current level, we're of the view that monetary policy is restrictive. The effect of this is most evident in the household sector, with a very weak growth in consumption and, in fact, a decline in per capita consumption. And we've also seen very low dwelling investment. Monetary policy settings will nevertheless need to remain restrictive until the Reserve Bank Board is confident that inflation is on track to return sustainably within the target range and approach its midpoint of 2.5%. Our forecast published in the November Statement on Monetary Policy suggests that a sustainable return to target will occur in 2026. Elevated inflation indicates that the level of demand in the economy is above the ability of the economy to supply the goods and services demanded. But the evidence suggests that this gap is narrowing. One reason for this is that the rate of growth of demand has been quite subdued, as you can see from this chart. The subdued rate of GDP growth, in turn, reflects the notable weakness in household consumption that I referred to earlier. Looking ahead, we anticipate a slight uptick in both GDP growth and household consumption over the coming year, but there are risks in both directions. One important influence on the outlook for household spending is conditions in the labour market. At present, we judge that conditions in the labour market remain tighter than what would be consistent with low and stable inflation. This assessment's informed by a wide range of indicators. As a summary, you can look at the unemployment rate, and it's currently hovering at around about 4.1%. This is notably low by historical standards and compared with many other countries. In addition, the increase in the unemployment rate over the last 2 years has been significantly smaller than some other countries. Now, while some labour market indicators have shown signs of easing, so the labour market easing, the demand for workers remains robust, particularly in sectors like healthcare and education. Overall, the earlier period of high inflation has imposed large costs on families and businesses across Australia, especially the most vulnerable in our society. If we fail to bring inflation down in a sustainable way, cost of living pressures will only compound and monetary policy would need to remain restrictive for longer. That's why returning inflation sustainably to target within a reasonable time frame remains the Board's highest priority. Now, recently, as I said, I've been asked why other central banks are lowering interest rates and the RBA is not. So to explain this, I need to describe what the Board is trying to achieve and ways in which we seem to be a little different from some other peer economies. Now, the Board sets monetary policy to achieve domestic policy objectives. That is, for inflation to be at about 2.5% over the medium term and the labour market at sustainable full employment. As it currently stands, as we've seen, underlying inflation is still too high to be considering lowering the cash rate in the near term. The Board's strategy over recent years has been to set monetary policy in a way that returns inflation sustainably to target in a reasonable time frame, alongside a gradual easing in labour market conditions to levels consistent with sustainable full employment. The goal underpinning this strategy has been to preserve as many of the jobs that have been created over recent years as we can. This is what we've previously referred to as the narrow path. Now, when setting policy, the Board aims to ensure that financial conditions are restrictive enough until it's confident that inflation is moving sustainably back to target. This overarching approach is similar to that used at other central banks in advanced economies, where we all have these flexible inflation targeting frameworks. All central banks care about inflation and the potential impact of their policies on the economy and the labour market. But there have been some important differences reflecting the different weights that central banks place on the two objectives. In Australia, interest rates did not reach the same levels of restrictiveness as many other countries. So you can see that from the tops of the blue bars in this graph here. And consistent with this, inflation has been somewhat higher relative to target here than in most of those economies, and the labour market is also tighter. This means that even with a similar approach to setting policy, the time to adjust domestic monetary policy settings can differ from peer-to-peer central banks. Indeed, Australia's labour market conditions appear unusually tight relative to those of other peer economies. Conditions in labour markets in those economies have eased significantly and unemployment has increased, such that labour markets are now assessed to be close to balance or have spare capacity. Given the tightness in Australia's labour market, along with our assessment that the level of demand still exceeds the supply in the broader economy, we expect it'll take a little longer for inflation to settle at target in Australia. Peer central banks have eased policy settings as they've become more confident that inflation is moving sustainably back towards their respective targets. But so far, most have all stated that they're only removing some restrictiveness. That is, central banks globally are still pushing against high inflation despite pulling back on the extent of restrictiveness somewhat. Their inflation rates now close to target and the easing they've seen in their labour market conditions, they're now turning their attention to downside risks in their economies and labour markets. Looking ahead for Australia, the RBA staff expect inflation to return sustainably to the 2.5% midpoint of the target range by late 2026, as restrictive financial conditions gradually bring the economy and the labour market into better balance. We still think we're on the narrow path. This staff forecast was conditioned on a forward path for the cash rate that's implied by market pricing at the time the November statement on monetary policy, which had the cash rate remaining at its current level over the near term. Now, I want to be really explicit here that this is not the board's forecast for interest rates. It's an assumption, a conditioning assumption we use, along with other information available at the time, and it is consistent with inflation returning sustainably to target within the board's time frame. That said, I want to just note that the central forecast for inflation has substantial bands of error around it. So as more information comes to hand, we will be reconsidering these forecasts and hence the appropriate stance of policy. Now, onto the process of monetary policy. The process that supports the board's monetary policy decisions is evolving. As many of you will recall, I think, the board previously met monthly for half a day on the first Tuesday of the month, except for January. This year, however, the board has met 7 times, and the 8th and final meeting for 2024 will be held the week after next in December. The length of the meetings has increased to a full day, spread over a Monday afternoon and the following Tuesday morning. And this change may seem quite small, but it's had an important impact on the monetary policy decision-making process. Specifically, by stepping down to 8 longer meetings, we've allowed for more deliberation and debate among board members. And more time between meetings has also meant usually there's more information for the board to reflect on and consider. The change to the board meetings has also allowed the RBA staff to adapt our processes to better support the board's decision-making. We've redesigned our staff-level meetings to focus more on the big questions and the risks to the outlook and monetary policy. We're actively encouraging a greater range of diverse perspectives and challenge to make sure that we're turning over every stone. And a summary of the different ways of viewing the economy is provided in the board papers at each meeting. Also, the external board members now regularly meet with a wider range of staff to discuss topics relevant to their decision-making. And these sorts of things are just one way we're bringing to life our cultural ambition for being open and dynamic, open to ideas and dynamic in the way we work. It's still a work in progress, but we're trying hard. The briefings that the board members now receive regularly include policy alternatives, scenarios, discussion of the trade-offs between the RBA's objectives of low, stable inflation and full employment. And we've drawn inspiration from peer central banks to enhance our practices, and they'll continue to evolve. Our practices will continue to evolve as we learn what works well here and how we can do even better. The RBA has, I think, always produced high-quality analysis, and our staff are well respected for their expertise. But challenging questions lie ahead, and we're best placed to tackle them by continually reflecting on how we can do things differently and what we can learn from others. So in this spirit, we're broadening and deepening our capabilities, our models, our engagement with people, ideas and organisations outside the RBA. One example of this is our new monetary policy strategy team, which we're in the process of establishing, and that's going to be tasked with deepening our policy analysis by encouraging debate and collaboration within the bank and harnessing know-how within the bank and outside the RBA. You'll also have noticed changes in the way we communicate. I've held media conferences after each of the board's decisions this year, and these obviously are going to continue into next year. Our publications are evolving too, and I hope you might have noticed this. The Statement on Monetary Policy, which we publish 4 times a year, has been restyled to be more transparent about our forecasts and assumptions and to give clearer explanations for our assessment of the economy and the risks around the baseline outlook. The Financial Stability Review too has undergone a change with a greater focus on clearer messages to explain our analysis. And we're going to continue to develop these publications as we enhance our communication strategy. But our transformation goes beyond reshaping how we set monetary policy. In April last year, we launched a 4-year transformation program based on the RBA review findings. We've set out to become a more open and dynamic central bank, trusted for our analysis and service delivery. We're now in the 2nd year of this initiative, and we've made a lot of progress, significant progress, but there's a lot of work remains. We are an organisation with broad responsibilities. Even though people think of us as, RBA sets interest rates, we have a lot of responsibilities. We regulate the payment system and we run the infrastructure used to settle interbank payments. We provide banking services to the Australian government, making payments that many Australians, and particularly vulnerable Australians, rely on for us. We issue the banknotes that, despite an overall decline in cash transactions, they remain an integral part of the Australian economy. And we monitor and contribute to financial stability in cooperation with other authorities. And we remain committed to communicating clearly with the public about what we do and why. Because of this breadth of responsibility, our transformation is complex. It involves enhancing leadership capabilities, creating a more open and dynamic culture, streamlining operations for greater efficiency and building resilience. These are goals that I think are shared by many organisations across Australia and I'm sure resonate with many of you. An often overlooked aspect of our role is our involvement in running the critical infrastructure used to settle payments. We're at the core of this system, ensuring it functions in a way that it can be relied upon by the households and businesses that make up the economy. We're also the regulator of the payment system with a mandate to promote competition, efficiency and safety of the payment system. In practice, nearly every electronic payment in Australia relies on the infrastructure operated by the RBA. Whether you're tapping a card for public transport or getting your salary or transferring money to your mate, many of them are processed in real time and they pass through our systems. Last year, the RBA settled approximately 3 million payments daily, worth almost $260 billion. So Australia's GDP every 10 days through our systems. It's a lot of money. If you think of the payment system as a train network, with the economy as the train moving vast volumes of transactions, we lay and maintain the tracks that keep the money flowing through the economy, supporting a strong financial system and efficient payments. As the payments ecosystem evolves, new players like digital wallets, buy now, pay later services have emerged, and they enhance competition and consumer choice. However, these new entrants also potentially introduce risks that may fall outside our current regulatory scope. Now, there are proposed amendments to the Payment Systems Regulation Act that aim to bring these new payment providers inside the regulatory perimeter. But in the meantime, we're consulting actively on some issues that we do currently have oversight of, our regulation of card payment systems and the role of surcharging, which has had a lot of media attention lately. And we expect the Payment System Board of the Reserve Bank to consider and respond to this consultation in the first half of next year. So in addition to consulting on regulatory settings, we're also investing significantly in our systems and technology to keep pace with rapid technological changes, the growing use of digital payments and the challenging security environment, which is on everyone's mind. The train tracks now need some maintenance. Ultimately, we need to maintain a modern technological framework that supports our operational and strategic objectives. These initiatives will modernise the infrastructure that powers our nation's payments and banking systems and allows money to move around the economy in a safe, efficient, reliable way. So in conclusion, the RBA has a pivotal role in promoting the economic stability and prosperity of Australia. We're currently facing significant challenge posed by persistent inflation, shifting geopolitical dynamics and a rapid pace of technological change. Yet I think these challenges also present us with opportunities to innovate and adapt and become better. Our transformation agenda is not simply a response to current pressures. It's a proactive approach designed to meet the needs of the Australian economy and people today and well into the future. By enhancing our decision-making processes, embracing transparency and engaging with diverse perspectives, we're positioning ourselves to navigate the complexities of the modern economy more effectively. Thank you, and I look forward to answer your questions. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Governor, for that, for those words. I think you've really drawn out for everybody the complexity of issues that the RBA is grappling with, but also the importance of transformation within the organisation to be future fit, not only for the decisions you need to make, but as you say, for the infrastructure and importance to the economy that the RBA has. So I'm looking forward to moderating the Q&A session. If you do have any questions or would like to vote on any questions, you can use the app, which I think the details for, there they are, they're on the screen at the moment. We'll also be taking some questions live in the audience as well, and I think there are people wandering around with microphones if you have a question, and I'll come to that. But I might kick off with a few questions, if that's okay, and I might start globally, Governor, and work down to more local issues. But if I start globally, you ended your remarks with a reference to the shifting geopolitical dynamics. So why don't we start there, and some of the questions coming through are about this as well. Let's talk about the US, the policies in the US, potentially are they inflationary for Australia? What do the threatened tariff wars mean for us, particularly in light of the last 48 hours where there's been discussion of tariffs on Mexico, China and Canada?
Yes, this is, apart from when are interest rates coming down, this is the second most question I think I get asked. So I think I'd first say that, look, at this stage it's hard to tell, because it's actually hard to tell what the new administration actually will do as opposed to what they say they're going to do. There is a lot of discussion about tariffs, and in particular the most recent salvos in terms of Mexico and Canada. I think that does remain to be seen, whether or not that's some sort of reality or it's a negotiating tactic, I don't know. But we have to set policy based on what we know, not based on shadows. And so I think the first point I would make is that although we are thinking about the potential implications, we are still mainly focused on what we're observing going on in Australia at the moment. Because if there are going to be implications for inflation and growth, they're not happening next month or even in 6 months. It's going to be out a little bit. So our focus needs to remain staying the course on inflation. Having said that, what happens if, say, there are tariffs imposed in the United States? And I think most people agree that the implications are potentially for inflation in the United States to rise, potentially inflation in some other countries. So what often happens with trade, though, is that trade moves. So if there are large tariffs, for example, on China, Chinese trade will probably try to find other ways to find an outlet, and Australia might even be a beneficiary of that. So we might in fact find some deflationary impacts for Australia if it rolls out that way. It depends often, it'll also depend very heavily on what others do. So we don't know how Europe might respond to tariffs on it We don't know how China will respond. So I think we need to just be alert to what might be happening in those other countries as well. And as I say, nothing's happening in the next it's not going to affect inflation in Australia in the next 6 months. To the extent that this sort of activity impacts China, that also is very important for us, because China is our largest trading partner, and what happens in China, when China slows down, that has impacts on our economy as well, and the growth of our economy. So I don't know the answer exactly what will happen. Yes, I think tariffs would be inflation in the United States. What happens here may well depend on what happens with trade, and what happens to China is going to be really critical.
I might stick with China then for a moment. Regardless of the tariff position, the economy remains sluggish, which obviously, as you said, has a big implication for us. Are you seeing impacts yet from the Chinese government on their stimulus policies?
So I think we're not seeing impacts just yet. Our judgment, and we wrote about this in our November statement on monetary policy, our judgment is that the efforts by the People's Bank of China to lower borrowing costs, to encourage lending into particular sectors, that sort of easing, I think, is positive, and some of the moves of the government to support consumption in the real estate sector, I think, are positive as well, and we revised up our forecasts a little bit for Chinese growth on the basis of that. The issues for China around the real estate sector, though, are still quite front of mind. It's a very challenging situation. Property prices in China have not risen. They've gone down a lot, and they've stayed very low. And people in China don't have a lot of confidence in some of them have paid for homes that they just haven't got. So there's not a lot of confidence in that whole development industry, the housing industry there, I think. So that's impacting the confidence of the Chinese consumer. So there's still issues there, but the Chinese authorities at least have shown some inclination to try and address the concerns, particularly about consumption. China's got deflation. Prices are falling. And it's unlike the rest of us are experiencing. So, you know, there are, I think, challenges in China that the government it does seem they are trying to address them.
And what do you think Australia should be doing to prepare for that, or seek to deal with the consequences there?
Well, our exports obviously are driven very much by commodities, and so commodity prices are likely to be impacted if China doesn't come out of this, and I think that means that obviously two things: one, that our national income isn't as strong as it was, and it impacts on government revenues as well. So it has impacts for us as well. So I think these are the sorts of things that, when we're thinking about where the appropriate monetary policy settings are, we'll need to be thinking about the impact of the slower China on our growth and what that might mean for the inflationary pressures in our economy. At least at a first order level, you would expect that it would be slightly disinflationary for us.
I opened by asking you the second most question you've been asked. Do you mind if I go to the first most? Yeah, thanks. Specifically, you said a moment ago, and you also said in the November statement of monetary policy, that a sustainable return to inflation target, your expectation is that will occur in 2026. The market generally are expecting a rate cut February, March, May 2025. Are we waiting for a rate cut in 2026, or what are you looking for?
Why does everyone always want forward guidance?
No. This has all got a big legal disclaimer on it. Don't worry. It's fine. It's fine. Don't rely on any of this too much. No. So should we be thinking about 2026, or what are you looking for in 2025 to give you confidence that we'll be where we want to be in 2026?
So our forecast, even though it's got those very wide error bands around it, our central forecast at the moment is that by the end of 2025 we will be back down below 3%. But we don't think it's good enough just to be just below 3%. The reason you aim at 2.5 is because it gives you a little bit of leeway on either side. So we think we'll be back there by, that's according to the central forecast, by the end of 2025. And provided and so far our forecast, it's gradual, it's slow, but so far we seem to be trending in the direction we think. So provided we continue along that trajectory, then we will be in a position at some point to consider whether it's appropriate to cut rates. But as I said earlier, and as I showed in that graph, overseas countries had much more restrictive, we judge much more restrictive policy than we did. We judge we've got restrictive policy, but it wasn't as restrictive as some. And if you look at some of the countries that are lowering interest rates quite a bit, Canada and New Zealand in particular, who we often compare ourselves with, both of those countries now have unemployment rates. I think Canada's unemployment rate's got a 6 in front of it. The New Zealand unemployment rate's rising quite quickly as well. So they are lowering interest rates in response to what they're seeing happening in their employment markets, which will flow on, and they're seeing it flow on to their inflation rate as well. So we've got these central forecasts. There are error bands around them, and as I said earlier, it could be that inflation falls more quickly. If consumption in particular doesn't pick up like we're forecasting it will, it could fall more quickly. And if it does, then the board will be taking that into account and responding.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm trying to keep the audience happy. But there may be a scenario where you're considering a rate cut in 25 in expectation that inflation will be where you want it to be in 26.
So let me be clear. If you look at overseas countries, they are cutting interest rates even though they haven't reached their target yet because they're expecting to do so. And I think I've said this before when people have asked me, do you need to be back at the target before you cut interest rates? No, we don't. But we need to be pretty convinced that we need to have a fair degree of confidence that that is where we are heading. So you don't have to be there, but you have to have a pretty good degree of confidence that you are heading there.
Thanks. You talked about, also in your remarks, you mentioned the narrow path, and I think you said that you still think we are on track for the narrow path. What flags will you be looking at in the coming months that might alert you to the fact that we're moving off the narrow path?
So I think there's a few things. The first is obviously we're going to be looking at inflation. We're going to be looking at the labour market. Those things, though, are backward looking in the sense that they're behind us. So we're also looking at a lot of forward-looking surveys. So we look at some of the commercial surveys like the NAB survey, Westpac, these sorts of things. We also have our own liaison program, and the bank's liaison program, I think we probably talk to around about 1,000 businesses/business groups a year. So we've got a very broad, it's 20 odd years old, this particular liaison program, and it's been set up in a way that we can look over time at responses to questions, and it's pretty good intelligence, I think. So the things we'll be looking for there are what they're telling us about what's going on with consumers, what's going on with the labour market, what are they seeing about their selling prices. Now, at the moment, the readings we're getting from these sort of forward-looking indicators are that the labour market is easing, but it's still marginally difficult to find staff in some areas. Selling price pressures are easing, but they're still seeing costs rising, so not as much as they were, but they're still a little bit elevated. So these are the sorts of things that we'll be looking to continue to see ease in order to be convinced that we're heading on the continuing to head on the narrow path.
While we're talking about growth and unemployment, my daughter, who's studying Year 11 economics, has a question, if you don't mind me asking. But GDP growth remains slow, but unemployment is low. Shouldn't we be expecting, if we have a strong labour market, should we not be expecting to see increased confidence, household spending, and hence growth?
What's your daughter's name?
Chloe.
All right, Chloe. This is a sort of a this is a sort of a bit of a conundrum that people focus on. So the economy isn't really growing very much, and I think I showed that in that graph. But employment is still strong, as you point out. The point I try to make here is that a difference between levels and growth rates. So if you look at the level of demand, it's still quite elevated relative to history. Even though it's not growing, it's still quite elevated. So we've got this situation where demand overall is holding up level, it's not growing, and that's generating a demand for labour to meet that demand, if you like, because all the indications are that we're trying to supply goods and services that are being demanded and we're still not quite meeting them. And the way I would explain this, it seems a little bit sort of esoteric, I suppose, to think about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, but I'm sure everyone knows examples of the construction industry is a great example. It's not growing. Its construction isn't growing very much, but the level of demand in the construction industry is still such that we can't supply it. We can't get the people, in particular. They can't get the skills. So that's an example of where the level of demand is above the ability to supply it. And there's various examples like that, I think, around. The other one I often use is, it's not so much now, but I'm sure people remember back in 2023 when we were sort of just coming out of COVID, the hospitality industry, and you'd go to a restaurant and they couldn't get staff. Again, an example of demand for a service that we were finding it very difficult to supply. So it's a long way around to answer Chloe's question, which is that the demand level is still quite high, even though it's not growing, and that's what's generating the demand for jobs.
That's basically what I said to her as well. Thank you. There's a lot of focus on demand side inflation. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the supply side factors as well.
Yeah. So this is actually, the supply side is very important because when inflation took off in 2021, all around the world, there was a confluence of things that happened. The first was that because of COVID, we had supply chain issues and the ability to get goods. People were demanding lots of goods and the supply chains weren't able to supply them because of problems with getting staff. People were sick. There were situations where we had containers in one part of the world and they were needed over that part of the world. You know, it was all over the place. And at the same time, governments were spending fiscally, putting money in people's pockets. People couldn't go out, so what did they do? They decided they wanted to spend on goods. So big demand for goods, difficult supplying them, the price of goods goes up. I tried to buy an office chair at one point during that period. I couldn't get one for love nor money, and then I had to pay through the nose for it. So there was that to begin with. And then what happened was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that was a massive supply shock, and it was particularly in Europe, who depended heavily on Russian gas. And that had a big supply impact because it impacted energy prices, electricity prices. So that's an input to practically everything. So all of a sudden you had these two massive, you had supply chain issues, you had a massive energy shock, and you had demand rising. And the confluence of those things resulted in massive inflation. Now, at the time, there was a bit of a debate about it's transitory, don't worry, it'll go away by itself. And then the realisation came, and it was us, but I think it was also the rest of the world as well, everyone, well, actually no, demand's part of the story here as well. And interest rates were at emergency low levels. So we actually had to, what we had to do is we had to remove the stimulus before we could even start to put restrictiveness in place. So that's where the supply side thing comes in. And I think broadly we think that the supply side inflationary impulses have largely gone away now, and what we're dealing with is demand. Having said that, I would like to highlight a point that we often talk about internally and other central banks, and that is that I think in the world we're facing into, we're probably going to see more supply shocks because we've got these geopolitical things going on, we've got potential sanctions, we've got Middle East problems. All these things suggest that supply shocks, we've got the energy transition things happening. So there's all these potential shocks to the supply side of the economy which are going to potentially result in rising prices. And I think central banks are entering a challenging period in how do we handle those, because the traditional idea would be, well, it's temporary, you look through it. But if you get lots of these shocks and the inflation rate stays elevated for some time, then people will just start to assume that inflation is higher. And once inflationary expectations adjust, then it's very difficult to get inflation back down. So I think we've got some challenging times ahead.
How do we prepare for supply shocks, future supply shocks that you're talking about?
Well, it's challenging because you don't, by definition, you sometimes don't know where they're coming from, and they come as a bit of surprise. So I think we've just got to be alert to, and it's very difficult. The other point I would make here is that it's often difficult, as we saw in 2021-22, it's often difficult to determine at the time whether it's a supply shock or a demand shock. So I think we've got to be a lot more agile in thinking about what the source of the inflation issue is. I think we're going to need to think about what the government might need to think about, how it's responding to some of these things as well, whether monetary policy is the right way to respond to some of this stuff. But all I can say is I think we're going to have to be agile, and we're going to have to be very alert to the fact that that it might be supply side driving things.
May I ask one more direct question on interest rates? In the November board minutes, the board stated that they were not ruling anything in or out on interest rate cuts, implying that there may be circumstances where the next move might be up. What might be the circumstances where that would be the case?
So I talked earlier about our forecast and our forecast of inflation coming back down to just under 3 in end of 2025. If the data that we're seeing and the information we're getting from our liaison and so on suggests that inflation is picking up again, so it's not going to follow that trajectory, it's going the other direction, then that would be a very big red flag for us. So again, I think the focus has to be for us on inflation. There might be some indications of that coming out of the labour market. So if it looks like the labour market is increasing in tightness again, then that might be another thing to watch. But provided we've got inflation continuing along this trajectory, we think that we can stay where we are for the time being, and this will deliver us the narrow path.
That was my last question on interest rates. There is one on in the app, though. I'm sorry, but we had a question here on the app, which is the October board minutes said you want more than one good quarterly inflation figure before rate cuts. Have we had a good one yet?
What I'd say is that so far what we've had is in line with what our forecasts are. So I think that's positive. We're continuing to see the trajectory we are forecasting. So I don't want to give the impression that we are focusing on one single data point or two single data points. It's broader than that. We are considering, yes, the inflation numbers do tell us a lot about what's going on in the economy, but we'll be looking at other things as well, and as I said, we'll also be looking at the forward indicators. Slight change of tack, but another question from the app.
Governor, are we in a recession disguised by immigration and public sector job growth funded by deficits? Because it feels like that in the private sector.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say we're in a recession, and the reason I wouldn't say we're in a recession is because the labour market is strong. Now, it's true that the market sector in employment isn't growing and the non-market sector is. And some people make quite a lot of that, and I think it is reflective of what's going on in consumption of discretionary goods and services by people. That's why the market sector isn't doing as well. Having said that, growth in employment in the non-market sector is actually good. It's teachers, it's nurses, it's aged care workers. These are all people that we need. So I don't buy into the idea that growth in non-market sector employment is not a good thing. It is a good thing. We need these people. And what it's just demonstrating, I think, is that and some of these things, obviously, there's going to be a bit of a shift in demand for some of these things as well. So I don't think we're in recession. I think people are employed. When you see surveys and you see the unemployment statistics, the underemployment numbers now have levelled out a bit. People are able to get jobs, which means they're able to meet, not everyone, but on average, most people are able to get jobs and they're able to meet their commitments. And so, for that reason, I wouldn't say we're in a recession. No.
With the follow-on question on the app, therefore, you don't think we're in a per capita recession?
See, I know I don't really like that term per capita recession. So, the concept of this, you're in a recession if you have 2 quarters of negative growth. It came out of a NBER article in the United States which correlated number of what they called recessions with the number of quarters of negative growth. And so people have now abstracted that to say, well, if I get 2 quarters of negative GDP per capita growth, then that's a per capita recession. I think defining it in that way actually abstracts from what's important here. And usually in recessions, you're experiencing high unemployment rates, people are losing their jobs. It's really, really bad. And I think in the current environment, we're not in a recession. Yes, people are having to spend less, people are having to cut back. But as I said earlier, basically people are able to find work, they're able to get the hours they want, and that doesn't feel to me like a recession.
I know your views on this next topic, but I just work here. So, can you please share your thoughts on the need for greater productivity in Australia? Where do you think the improvements may come from?
I said this earlier. People seem to think that the Reserve Bank Governor is the expert on everything. Look, I'm not an expert on productivity. And obviously we have a Productivity Commission headed up by Danielle Wood, who is an exceptional economist, and the Productivity Commission has lots of great ideas on this. My only comments on this really would be that, yes, we've had a poor productivity performance. Productivity growth has been declining, not only in Australia but around the developed world for decades. Coming out of COVID, the only exception to poor productivity has been the United States. They've had very strong productivity growth. Everyone else has, advanced economies have typically had very poor productivity growth. It's all been mucked around by COVID, and it's very difficult to read too much into the quarterly numbers. Having said that, if we want to grow our living standards, we need productivity growth in the economy. I think that there is some hope in technology. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but I think technology does provide hope for improvement in productivity. I also think that, in that sense, education and training is going to be really critical to productivity growth going forward, because there's going to be movement in the types of jobs that are available. People are going to need to be trained. Some people are going to find their job no longer exists perhaps, or it's smaller, but other jobs will spring up. So it's going to be really important that we have appropriate training. And that's the sort of thing that will help to improve productivity as well. So the Productivity Commission has a long list of these things. Business dynamism is another thing that's really important here, and I think the coming out of COVID with lots of support for businesses and lots of support for hanging on to their staff, maybe as we get back more into more normal times, we'll get a bit more business dynamism, we'll get more of people, staff moving from less productive firms to more productive firms, which will help. So, but again, this is going to happen overnight, and I think we think that over the next few years, we are still forecasting that we will get back to a positive productivity growth. So maybe I'm the glass half full.
Turning to the RBA itself, one of our questions via the app is that the Senate is likely to vote tonight on the RBA board reforms. What do you think those changes will mean for the board and how you set policy?
So if the changes go through, as some of you may know, we'll have a specialist monetary policy board and then a governance board. When I talked earlier, I talked about a lot of the stuff we do which is not to do with monetary policy, and there's a lot. It's, at the moment, I am accountable for all of that. I am the accountable authority, not the board. Under the new framework, if it goes through, then the governance board will be accountable for the operations of the bank, which is a substantial amount. So I think there'll be two things. Obviously, there'll be a lot of things that the governance board will take an interest in assisting me. The monetary policy board, the concept is that the monetary policy board now can concentrate just on monetary policy. Having said that, we've already made a lot of changes, as I set out, to the way we operate the Reserve Bank board at the moment, and we are already leaning into some of these changes. So if it goes through, I think that there's clearly going to be some structural things that are going to go on, but I think that the monetary policy board, I think we're already moving that direction. So we're just going to keep on moving that direction and basically being agile.
Speaking of those reforms, you talked a little bit about the work the bank is doing to modernise, and part of that transformation is building broader engagement, listening to a diversity of voices and outside opinions. I would have thought you get plenty of outside advice, but how do you actually make sure that you are getting that outside advice and distinguishing that from just the outside noise?
So I talked earlier about our business liaison program. It's really important, and it's very structured. Over a period of over 20 years, they catch up. They try to basically weight the businesses they talk to relative to the weights of the Australian economy. They have questions that they ask that they can track over time how these things are moving, and we can see that actually, with a history of this, that these things don't do a bad job of tracking sentiment and activity in the economy in many cases. So we do that. I would say too that I get a lot of letters. I meet and I read them, and so I get a lot of views that way. We do get organisations coming in to meet with us at various times. Some of the ones that more recently I periodically meet with, Lifeline, I've met with Beyond Blue, for example, ACOS, these sorts of organisations that we wouldn't necessarily be picking up in stock standard. Our liaison team meet with these sort of organisations as well, but we wouldn't necessarily be picking that up in statistics. So I think they're important sort of liaisons. But all of this information we gather, whether it's sort of in a structured way through the liaison program, whether it's through talking to people and hearing views, we take that away, we lay it across what we can see in terms of the data, and we see if it basically seems to line up. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't.
one of the questions that came through on the app was just in relation to the upcoming federal election. And I guess the question really is about the risk of government spending and whether you'd care to provide any advice to the parties as we lead up to the election in terms of, I'm assuming, a restraint in spending.
I have no advice. The only comment I would make is that the thing that, and it was a point made earlier, that the private sector at the moment is growing very slowly. Consumption's per capita is declining, consumption's growing slowly. Government, it's true, government spending is helping to keep the economy at least on an even keel at the moment. If it wasn't there, if it wasn't filling that gap, then things might well be much worse in terms of the employment market. And what we have in terms of our forecasts is that we are seeing, as I said, inflation is coming back down to target with the current sort of fiscal monetary settings, and we think we can get there with this and without completely tipping the labour market off the edge. So I think that's positive.
I have a couple more questions, but I just want to make sure I'm not missing anybody in the audience who's got one. No, you talked about outside voices, and I know that part of the role is engaging with your counterparts around the globe. Any interesting insights coming from them about how the global economy is going and what the broader trends are there?
Nothing I can say here.
It's a pretty tight group.
Look, the only thing I would say is I think that my colleagues at other central banks, some of them are lowering interest rates. They are happy enough with the way that inflation is coming down, but I think they are all remaining still a little bit alert to the fact that inflation might surprise on the upside. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to backtrack, but I think it's just natural for central banks to worry a little bit about the upside because, as I've sort of said and others have said before me, it is if you let inflation get away and inflation expectations get away, it's very costly to get it down. And so we even though we are trying to keep inflation, not sort of completely toss the economy into the abyss to get inflation down. We're trying to bring it down slowly. We do need to be alert that we don't let inflation expectations get out of control, and we need to be alert, therefore, to those upside risks. So I think, it's a balance, and I think my colleagues overseas are all alert to those sorts of things as well.
Just changing tack and just reflecting on your time in your role as Governor, which has been about 15 months, and obviously you were Deputy Governor before that. But has anything surprised you about being in the main gig?
Not greatly. I mean, I did observe. I was only Deputy Governor for a little over a year when Phil was there, Phil Lowe, and so I sort of observed what was going. So there wasn't great surprises there, and I have worked in a lot of different areas of the bank, so there wasn't any surprises to me in terms of various areas of the bank. I knew basically the business. I'd worked in most of those areas, so that wasn't. I think what's marginally surprised me is the great deal of interest in me. and the media interest. I think that's, I saw it, but I don't think I quite realised what it was going to be like. So I think probably for me that's been the most surprising thing. That and the fact that everyone expects me to have an opinion on everything, and sometimes I don't. So yeah, that's probably the thing for me. But having said that, I mean, it's a great honour. to have been appointed to this position, and I am surrounded by smart, dedicated, professional people who really do have the public interest at heart. I know sometimes, and certainly in letters I get, people don't believe that, but we do really have the public interest at heart, and I'm very fortunate to be in this job.
I might just close then just by, I think you mentioned maybe you were glass half full already, but just as you look forward, multiple challenges, local, global, lots of uncertainties, but are you in fact glass half full?
Yeah, I am a glass half full person, and my deputy reckon he's the glass half empty person. So maybe we're together. We're about right. I am the glass half full person, and I do believe that there are better times ahead for us. We've just got to get inflation down, because there's a lot of publicity about interest rates and people saying, you know, interest rates are hurting. But the thing that is really hurting, and I know I've said this a lot, but I just really think it bears repeating, it's inflation that is hurting people. That is hurting absolutely everyone. And so we need to get that under control. I'm confident that we are getting it under control. I know the board will do what we need to do to get it under control. There's a lot of people in Australia who have never experienced inflation before this most recent episode, because we hadn't had any in 30 years, really. It had been round about 2, a bit less. So it's no surprise, really, that people are hurting and they're really shocked by all of this. So we need to get it back, and the phrase I use, I want it in the background. I don't want people thinking about it. And so that means we've got to get it back down into the band, and I'm confident we can. There's going to be challenges ahead, but I'm confident that we and other authorities, we can rise to those challenges.
Thanks very much, Governor. I think that's a great place to finish. Please, yes, thank you.